One of the major things that came out in this survey was priests ordained after 2010. Only 8% identified themselves as theologically progressive, whereas those who were ordained before 1975, it was 70%.
So I don't find conservative and liberal to be helpful terms because there's obviously generational gaps in how it was defined in the 70s and 80s.
You know, if they grew up in the 60s and 70s when everything in society had shifted as far as sexual morals, and that included a lot of leading moral theologians within the church, who basically were saying that all the church's moral teachings are going to shift. So to be on the front edge of this is actually to be a good person.
But now you're having this movement, especially with younger people, especially younger males, that they're gravitating towards more traditional liturgy, and going back to a conservative, more traditional liturgy becomes the standard of, are you a good Catholic and are you conservative?
Yeah. Right. As we start today's show, crazy stat, 90% of you who watch our content here at St. Dominic Media have not yet subscribed. So it's free, it helps us out. It's like donating without having to give any money. It takes 1 second. So I ask you to please subscribe today. It helps us to get the show out to more people and to support the good work that's happening here. So thanks so much for subscribing, and check out this next episode.
So wanted to talk today about a report that came out recently by the Catholic Project at CUA, talking about generational divide between priests. So they're looking at priests who were ordained post-2010 versus those who were ordained before 1975. Before we get into the results of this, maybe I'm assuming you guys don't fall into that pre-1975 crowd. When were you all?
You were
ordained?
10, weren't you?
I was I was not born in 1975. No, I was ordained in 2010.
2010, okay.
Yeah.
I was ordained in 2011.
Yeah.
Okay. So you guys will both.
Or that you're saying I was 10 years old. So no.
All right, so post-2010, I got to keep all these numbers straight. One of the major things that came out in this survey was priests ordained after 2010. What was it? Only 8% identified themselves as theologically progressive, whereas those who were ordained before 1975, it was 70% identified as theologically progressive. So I'm curious, one, I think it's important before we just react to that, to define some terms. How do y'all hear that, theologically progressive, both in the context of today, but also thinking back 1975, what might that have meant back then?
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, our seminary formation took place with a lot of guys. Our formators would have fallen more into that kind of the older camp, whether they're professors or priests. And so a lot of the concerns that they were bringing forward, a lot of kind of the movements was trying to be in favor of the Second Vatican Council and kind of the reform movements of the church, trying to get outside of the church, maybe getting more into areas of works of justice or concern for the poor. That was always kind of like a major motivating factor for them. So for me, when I hear kind of that progressive from a 1975 priest, it seems like that probably is a lot more what they would be kind of referring to. If today, if you were asked what would progressive theologically be, we probably would go in some different areas. But I don't know. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, the 1975 ones.
Yeah, I mean, I usually try to qualify my terms as well when talking with people. So I don't find conservative and liberal to be helpful terms because there's obviously generational gaps in how it was defined in the 70s and 80s. And even to a certain extent, if you look at that, a 70s liberal is going to be a little bit different than a 90s liberal. And likewise, a 70s conservative obviously is a little bit different socioeconomically. And then we're adding not just socioeconomics, but then you're also adding in liturgy, because you can be liturgically liberal, you can be liturgically conservative, you can be morally conservative, morally liberal. You can be economically the question is when you're dealing with that is defining your terms. So obviously being 2011 myself, I would kind of look at those terms a little more strictly.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point, Father, that the formators of those who are reporting, far less theological progressivism, their formators in seminary are those guys who did identify that way from being ordained before 1975. So why might it be the case if that's the formation they're receiving in seminary, you guys received in seminary, why might there be a difference between how your formators would identify and y'all identify?
Yeah, I mean, I think now guys who are receiving formation now, most of their formators are more myself and Father Tom's age. You know, guys that have been now in their 40s, guys who are kind of have been ordained 10, 12, 15, 20 years. So it's kind of like in and around the time that we've been ordained, or how long we've been serving in this position within the church, which is fascinating to me that I'm old now. I remember when I was a young priest. Back in the days.
Old, man.
Yeah, but I think the church has shifted in in a sense, the world has shifted around the church in so many substantial ways, and so many projects as far as like what's going to save the church have unfolded in the past 40 years. Whether it was, once we get the liturgy, or 60 years, once we get the liturgy in the vernacular, once the Mass becomes in English, or once we start having guitars at Mass, or once we have, once we get out on the streets and march for social justice, once we start getting involved in political issues and campaigning against abortion, that's going to solve the church. Once we start having the charismatic renewal, once we start having now the liturgical renewal, once we start using Latin again, if only we use Latin. So in a sense, there's always kind of like these things that are being brought forward that are viewed by the old guard as something kind of new and in a sense progressive, while it maybe is trying to be more conservative. So I think there's always kind of going to be that give and take, and it's always buoyed up by youthful optimism. When I was in seminary, I knew exactly what the church needed and what was going to renew the church, how to transform a parish, even though I'd never worked in a parish before, had no real experience. But, for me, it was as long as I'm theologically conservative, dynamic in preaching, and have good catechesis, then everything's going to take care of itself. 15 years in, I realized that things are a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. I'm curious y'all's thoughts about the papacies that these younger priests came up in, how that might have influenced. Because I think about guys ordained 2010 and later, they would have grown up with St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI. I'm curious your thoughts. What, if any, do you see as the influences from those papacies?
I mean, obviously, we grew up during the John Paul II, and for a long time, that was the only conceivable pope that you could actually have. And John Paul was obviously morally conservative, anti-communist, helped bring down the communists. So I think that there was also our generation, I would say, looks at probably from that John Paul influence and sees the importance of speaking out on political issues, because John Paul spoke on political issues a lot, especially as it dealt with communism, and he also talked a lot on moral issues in terms of abortion. So I think that you do have a lot of influence from John Paul II in our generation. I think probably, though, a better thing maybe than the popes, though, is also another dynamic of the generations is probably the sexual abuse scandals. So guys who were also, I'd say that to me is actually probably a bigger delineator between kind of the old guard and the new guards. Were you ordained a priest during the midst of the sexual abuse crisis and then subsequently after that, or were you ordained prior to the sexual abuse crisis? Because guys, we lost a lot of creditants during the sexual abuse crisis, priests just in general. So priests kind of were held up on this pillar. What they said was kind of authoritative and no one really questioned it. Now, subsequently, after the sexual abuse crisis, you have priests who say things, and a lot of that just natural creditance that was given to the authority and to the institution of the church and to priests was lost, or at least severely impacted. So I think that also goes to like the quality and likewise the type of guys who came out of the seminaries after that. Because like when I went in, it was like when I started in undergrad, the sexual abuse crisis had just blown up when I was in. Then I was discerning, and then I went into seminary in 2005, 6. I think it was 5 or 6 that I went in, and so like that was like present and heavy on everyone's mind. The guys who were going in, I think prior to that, it was an easier time, and so like you have a lot more guys who are coming through the seminary during that time who ended up being fighters. Because you had to fight for your vocation, because you were no longer, even when you went, like I remember walking through airports and things like that when I was a deacon, and like I'd get sneers and glares and things like that, because like the Pennsylvania report had just come out and you get all these different stuff. So a lot of the guys who I think were just kind of going through and coasting through the seminary, or who were just looking for those kind kind of a more comfortable life. It wasn't a comfortable life going through seminary in the 2000s. So I think that also has impacted the type of guys who are coming out of the seminary. So you don't, kind of the ones who are just looking for just like a prestigious title and some of that is no longer really a thing, or at least less of it.
And going, I mean, this is kind of how these things interplay with each other as well, because I would agree that the sexual abuse crisis has shaped it. Because in a sense, the crisis unfolded in the mid-2000s or early to mid-2000s, continues to unfold. We continue to get to new layers. But it's, the events were happening before that, and up until that time too. And you know, that in a sense, a lot of that was the fallout of actually exposing what had been going on for a very long time. So a lot of guys maybe grew up in a time, you know, if they grew up in the 60s and 70s when everything in society had shifted as far as sexual morals, and that included a lot of leading moral theologians within the church that were accepted during that time. People like, you know, Hans Kung or
Rahner.
I'm blanking on the guy who from Catholic Youth, Skilebecks as well, who basically were saying that all the church's moral teachings are going to shift. So to be on the front edge of this is actually to be a good person within the church. So in a sense, we still have some vestiges of that now with certain kind of, you know, more progressive or leftist theologians or popular voices, certain celebrity priests within the church who kind of, you know, try to make that same point. But it was more mainstream as a theological concept in American seminary formation, to where if you weren't in favor of that, you probably wouldn't be ordained. That's the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now the fallout of that, obviously, amongst many other things, when you have all this sexual abuse being exposed, and so much of it being linked to homosexual activity within the priesthood or within the seminaries, that in a sense kind of like the opposite reaction is only natural there. So we were kind of ordained right in the midst of that. I feel like we're still, like the church in the United States is still kind of getting its footing, because when it gets to the popes, like the guys who are in seminary now, they have no context of John Paul II, other than maybe some old, you know, some videos they've seen, or maybe they heard a talk on the theology of the body. But for the guys that are in seminary now, maybe Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, they have some living memory of him, but it's very, very little. So in a sense, and then their own engagement with Pope Francis, who his own way of dealing with the American church in particular, which was usually pretty critical. Seems a lot of guys within seminary now seem to not be comfortable with that. So it almost becomes, well, they don't have really contact with John Paul II, who for us was this living saint, this guy who battled communism, this guy who stood up, you know, at the World Population Conferences and spoke the truth about the dignity of the human person, spoke against abortion, against the death penalty, was this bold, amazing figure, or Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, who is this dynamic Orthodox figure as well. They don't really have that context on the international stage. So then it kind of becomes sort of an idea of what happened way back in the past, or becomes what they discover online. And so it becomes more of like who's the internet pope of the day, which to me is I'm old. It's crazy to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to find an internet personality, and they're the ones who are going to shape my understanding of the church. But that's very normal nowadays for guys who at this moment are going through seminary. Yeah,
and I think the abundance of the personalities, and you can find these little silos of viewpoints, and even within conservative or traditional or progressive, like whatever, choose your label, you dive into that now and you can find all sorts of camps within that take it in different directions, where it's like, yeah, I'm thinking about y'all's understanding of the church and who formed that and what was accessible to you was greatly limited. So the next stat, major stat of this study was for priests, again, ordained after 2010, 51% self-identify as politically conservative, so not talking theologically now, but politically conservative, compared to just 8% of those who were ordained before 1975, which I'd be interested in get your thoughts on, but also interesting to think like what we would have labeled as conservative in 1975 looks very different than what it does in 2025, as what we would say is conservative now versus even 10, 15 years ago is very different. So anyways, interested to hear your thoughts. Why might there be this change in political conservatism among these younger priests?
So in a sense that it's expanded that much, it's grown that much. From 8% to now
51,
over half.
Yeah.
I would say it would probably surprise people that it's that low among priests. I think most people would say like, oh yeah, Catholic priests, you're all super conservative, and that automatically translates into a political conservative in the mindset. But for me, that's kind of a hopeful stat, and that it's showing that for the priests who are seriously engaged with this, that even though they are hopefully, God willing, they're taking the gospel stance against abortion, in favor of the poor, in favor of the dignity of immigrants and migrants, in favor of marriage, like all those things that are Christian before they're any sort of political category, but wouldn't find an easy home in in kind of a political camp. So that's kind of fascinating to me, and probably a good sign. But it would probably be on the flip side of that, a much lower number that would consider themselves today who are politically liberal, as it was back in 1975. Which again, I wasn't alive in 1975, so I'm not quite sure what the zeitgeist was. Was liberal means you didn't like Nixon or something, or you were against the Vietnam War? I mean, like seriously. I mean, those are probably a lot of the things that were pushing that, which I would consider probably most priests, if they were standing up for the civil rights movement, if they were against the Vietnam War, that would have automatically labeled them as anti-conservative or liberal at that time, which I think is probably pretty. Maybe the church has stayed the same, or priests have kind of stayed the same politically. It's just that the world around us has shifted.
You're bringing up a good point about what does conservative mean? You mentioned this with theological conservatism. Are we talking moral? Are we talking liturgical? Like there's different realms within. So politically, there's going to be different realms, but also in this we're adopting the world's language, as you pointed out, Father Tom. And we have these two camps of the left and the right, traditional, progressive, whatever, conservative, progressive. There's also a large number identifying as moderates, this study shows, which again goes to your point of the hopefulness. So yeah, what are they identifying as politically conservative for? But also, I'd be interested to hear you speak a little bit more, maybe Father Tom, to get your perspective on what does it mean for a Catholic not to find a home and identifying as moderate? Why might that be a large portion of these numbers coming forward in the study? Yeah,
well, I mean, imagine that just looking at the extreme polarization which is happening within the country, politically speaking, in the Republican, Democrat, and kind of the far right, far left. And so I think you're finding a lot of people who maybe 10 years ago were comfortable with this, but I think that there are more and more people who are finding the extremism and kind of these extreme positions to be off-putting, and as well as they're just kind of ridiculous. I mean, so I think that, but then that transfers over into the faith life. So when you're looking at things like that, so I think that there's a lot of people who are taking a much more balanced, looking at things. Well, I don't want to necessarily be, for instance, I'm morally speaking, I'm against abortion, but then you're also seeing what's going on in terms of immigration and so forth. And so people are taking it as opposed to saying, well, you have to be either fit into the Republican Party narrative of conservative, or you fit into the Democrat of conservative. But Catholic is much broader. I think also looking at Catholic doesn't just mean American Catholic. The Catholic Church is a worldwide organization. So what's conservative in South America is different than what's conservative in North America, and what's liberal in North America is different than what's liberal in South America, and likewise to Asia and to Europe and to things like that. Because I mean, but from the way I would look at, for instance, a controversial figure like Pope Francis, which obviously for many of the people who are in the seminary right now is their major pope that they kind of grew up with in their teens. But Pope
past 13 years.
Yeah, past 13 years. So, but
most of their all of their adult life, at least.
Yeah. So, Pope Francis is, by American standards of conservative and liberal, that's where everyone kind of put Francis into a very liberal pope. But by South American standards, Pope Francis was a conservative. It's just that conservatism in South America looks different than conservatism in the United States, because Pope Francis was anti-abortion, pro-family, generally moderate when it came to LGBTQ issues. He wasn't going to normalize it and said it was always a sin, it was wrong, but wanted to keep the door open, so he kind of had a moderate perspective on that. Liturgically, Pope Francis was pretty moderate. He wasn't known for high liturgies, like the Latin liturgies and things like that. but he also wasn't just kind of going off on his own and things like that. So, and then like you had social issues where Pope Francis was very would have been seen by an American perspective being liberal, but most of his stuff was focused on the environment and immigrants, which So that's the thing is,
he wasn't in the South American sense of liberal would have been liberation theology,
correct?
Which is basically like you got to stand up for the poor to the point of taking up arms against those in power, forcibly, which he would be against. And so he was definitely not at home with that in South America.
Because if you're liberal in South America, you're a communist. And Francis was not a communist by any sense. It was just that he didn't fit into the categories. And likewise, when you're looking at guys from Africa, like some of the African bishops are extremely morally conservative, but they also tend to be, from what I can tell, a lot of them tend to be very liturgically conservative as well. Especially
maybe economically liberal,
and economically liberal,
as international aid, as far as dependence on, let's say, China or other world powers. So, and again, we kind of want to put it something clear, but when you're a bishop in West Africa, whose people are struggling to survive, who's having to fight off syncretism on one side, ancestor worship, encroaching Islamic militant sort of stuff going on the other side. You've got within your own dynamic, you've got people who are struggling because of polygamy, because that's been a normalized part of their culture for centuries. How do we live Christianity and Catholicism within that? And then you've got aid coming in from international organizations. How do we balance that as well? So in a sense, it's a very different problem. So that their response politically is going to be very different than the American political right, which is basically America first at all times, And so
correct. But then you also got obviously the immigration issue is a big, huge issue right now, which is kind of separating. And sometimes people getting upset with even Pope Leo, some of his more recent ones. But if you're in South America, right, and you're from South America, like where you see a tremendous amount of social inequalities, but also you see a lot of pollution. Like I've been to the Dominican Republic, been down to Jamaica, been down to you've been to Mexico, and like when the further south you go, the more you start seeing some of these real issues like pollution. You start seeing economic deforestation and the environmental impacts that it has upon especially low-income people and the poor. And so that's
how that impacts migration.
How that impacts migration. Huge. So when you're down in South America, these are present day issues that are not just absent across on the opposite side of the world. Versus in the United States, we just see floods of immigrants coming across the border, but people who are from the South, and that's the thing, is Pope Francis, people accuse him of being this radical liberal, but really he was there was the liberals, the radical liberals in South America couldn't stand Pope Francis because they're like, he's a conservative. You think he's a liberal. That's what I read multiple articles from these very liberal South American journalists and priests who were just like, Francis is a conservative, they hated him because he wasn't pushing social reform to the point of violence and things like that. So that's what I'm saying. These categories of liberal and conservative are sometimes they're very. I don't find it to be helpful because you can also have a person who's very morally conservative, who is liturgically liberal. Yeah. They're not following the letter of the law, or they're a little bit more relaxed in terms of their liturgical practice. But now you're having this movement, especially with younger people, especially younger males, that they're gravitating towards more traditional liturgy. And there's a combination where sometimes they're to be liturgically conservative, so wanting to go back to a Latin Mass, kneeling when you're receiving communion, which are all fine things. Those are fine things, and to have that as a preference. But there's an equation where liturgically conservative and going back to a conservative, more traditional liturgy becomes the standard of, are you a good Catholic and are you conservative?
Yeah. Right.
Versus in the 90s. In the 90s and early 2000s, to be conservative, the major thing, at least in Catholic circles, was, were you anti-abortion?
Right.
And were you anti...
Do you believe the Eucharist is really Jesus'
real
body,
presence, the Eucharist? That was kind of the standard of conservatism. And then, in the standard of liberalism in the in the 90s and 2000s for us, it was were you pro-liberation theology? Were you for social
women's ordination?
Women's ordination, and then the beginnings of the LGBTQ stuff. Were you pushing for those types of things? But now it seems as people are in the modern kind of the modern milieu, is that it's a lot more is focused on the liturgy I think that there's also a reason for that because there's a lot of people have seen really poorly done liturgies.
Growing up with it. Well, and this goes back to the point of the shift for guys that are in seminary now. I was just reflecting on this. You know, we always have a seminarian here for their pastoral year, which is great. So I keep in touch with the seminary, and hearing from the seminary sort of this reality of guys that are in seminary now. It's kind of the first major generation of guys in formation for the priesthood, who a lot of whom have never participated in a parish before.
Interesting.
Because their Catholicism a lot of times is all online.
Yeah.
They maybe started, they maybe started with kind of I don't know about life, and someone turned them on to Carl Jung, then Jordan Peterson, then Jonathan Peugeot, and then they got into Matt Fradd, and then they kind of like got into the liturgical movement, and then all of a sudden they're really concerned about liturgy, and they love they start listening to Latin, chant. All this stuff is beautiful and great, but in a sense, none of it is connected to an actual community. And if they are in the more traditional Latin Mass communities, a lot of times they're traveling to go to that Mass, so it's not actually their parish. It's a church that's hosting a Latin Mass. So that might be what I served at this Mass for forever. It wasn't my parish, but it was the one that and then they're accepted there, loved there. They got other brothers there that are encouraging them, and then from there they go to seminary. So in a sense, it's not bad, it's not evil or anything like that. It is what it is. But how much more so is that going able to impact people's views, guys who are studying for the priesthood? Where for us, and I don't want to speak for you, Father Tom, but for myself, I was always at the parish, but my view was always more towards kind of the church. Like my leadership was coming more from like Pope John Paul II. That was kind of more like the paradigm. And then at the parish, sometimes it was good, sometimes it was not so good, sometimes liturgically. There was good youth group activities and other things too, but in a sense, for what it meant to be a priest or what it meant to be a leader in the church, or what it was really all about was being what the Pope was saying, and that's kind of how I grew up in this. Now, guys are in a different place now, and sort of the voices that they're listening to have shifted. But I found that fascinating that you could want to become a priest, be in formation for the priesthood, and maybe never have actually been a part of a parish in any meaningful way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. So another stat that came out in this study was around the priest's experience of loneliness, and reporting that for those ordained post-2010, 40% of those priests would report feelings of loneliness on a regular basis, whereas those who were ordained before 1975, it was only, I'm blanking on the number.
25%.
25? Okay, 25. There we go.
Yeah.
A lot of numbers today. I'm curious, one, to hear y'all's personal reaction to that study, like even personally in your own priesthood, how that resonates with you or not. And also as you look at your brother priests, what are you seeing out there? Does that surprise you?
It does not surprise me. I mean, I'll say this because if you think of guys ordained in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, up until the 90s, really, that the norm for most parishes would have been at least 2 priests, sometimes 3 or 4. It's like the carryover of what was happening in the 50s and 60s. And I know that those numbers dropped off steeply 70s and 80s, but it was still the norm, to now where a lot of parishes and a lot of dioceses are basically having to restructure their parishes around having a 1/8 of the priests that they used to have. And so some guys are one priest for 5 parishes. Yeah. Praise God, that's not our situation in this diocese. But I know a lot of guys that are friends of mine that are dealing with that. And so the workload has increased sometimes, by factors of 10, and the number of guys doing it has decreased. And so if you're on the road between your 3 parishes and then you're coming home to an empty rectory, it's very easy. Now, just because you have a full rectory, just because you have a bunch of priests, there doesn't mean that there's good fraternity and good brotherhood or anything else. But there can be loneliness within that too. But I think it just kind of ups the possibility of things being lonely or just being a little more heavy to carry.
Yeah, Yeah, I jokingly say, my father Mike probably would agree. I don't really deal with a lot of loneliness because I'm too busy to be lonely. Usually, if I come home at the end of the night, it's usually late, and I'm enjoying those couple hours that I get to myself, and that I'm not. I love being with people and things like that, but we're both pretty busy. Sure. So I think that part of it is also a demographic. I look at it, so a lot of these things in terms of demographical changes. And I think that these are sometimes things that people are not always aware of. But we both come from larger, like a little bit larger families. So I have a sister who's in the city. I have 5 other sisters who are spread out throughout the South. My brother's in Pensacola. So I come from a larger Catholic family.
Yeah, and I'm one of 6 too.
And you're one of 6 too.
We're anomalies for most guys that we know.
You got your brother in Tallahassee. I mean, they're relatively nearby. So I think that also, looking at the shrinking family size in demographics, it used to be that Catholics were known for having 10, 12 kids. Now it's the Catholics, really, I don't think the Catholic birth rate is much different in the among Catholics than it is in the secular world. And in America, that means 1.6 to maybe a few more, 1 or 2 more, depending. But the point being is that, when you have, to me, loneliness is a lack of community. So if you have a lack of community, and now if you are a solo priest at 5 different places and you're kind of a sacramental Pez dispenser, which is kind of what I refer, you're just going around taking care of the sacraments and you're not building relationships, you're not building community because you're so overworked. I can understand very clearly why the guys who are overworked are lacking in community. But it's also where if you don't have, for me, the blessing of coming from a larger family is that I have the larger family, so I have that relationship of community just in my family, as well as obviously I'm actively working at it in the parish. So to me, I think it comes down to, as guys are being more overworked and we have a lack of priests and we have a severe shortage of priests, the time for community building and the time for family, whether that be, and as well as a lot of the guys who are coming to the seminary right now are coming from small families where they grew up with maybe 1 sibling, 2 siblings. I mean, I think that the amount of guys who are coming to the seminary right now, they just don't come from larger Catholic families because larger Catholic families don't, generally speaking, exist. Except for the ones who are coming from the homeschooler communities and things like that. And then you have and there is actually, I'd say, we're starting to see
we dabbled in homeschool. We couldn't be called a homeschool family.
Yeah,
my mom tried one year.
I was. So we're having more vocations. Also, some of them coming from the Catholics who are having larger families. But I do think that does impact. For me, I just can tell you this: it does impact obviously loneliness. So if you don't have your own particular family that's supporting you, that you grew up with, and then if you don't have that, then that doesn't surprise me.
That also, Father Tom, that brings up the point we were talking about earlier as far as the tendency to be more conservative, whether it's politically or liturgically or theologically for guys that are in seminary now. To me, that points to if most of us in our age group or the newer guys, the younger guys, have kind of, in a sense, been impacted and affected by the bad fruits of the sexual revolution. The aspects of divorce rates, the aspects of single parent homes, all the different things like that. So in a sense, what to speak of the proliferation of pornography and all, kind of those other bad fruits that people choosing seminary now, in a sense, are choosing against those things, against the things that have hurt them. So it makes sense to be that you would say, okay, if I've experienced the reality of the sexual revolution, what's the opposite of that? Oh, purity. Oh, chastity. Oh, the church's teachings on sex and marriage, which are liberating, beautiful, challenging to the world at large, but something that's so in a sense looking for something stable. And if you come from the chaotic society or a chaotic household, you can either end up becoming more chaos, or you can say, I want whatever the opposite of it is. I want something that's stable and firm, which I think probably gets into even the liturgical conservative kind of movements. I want a liturgy that's not going to have moved for 1,000 years. It's going to be stable. You know what to expect. It's not Father riding around on a hoverboard or
Barney costume,
or wearing a Barney costume.
I hope that's not real.
All the liturgical abuses. For those that know what we're talking about, all the liturgical abuses that have occurred. That people want a liturgy that is solemn and somber and transcendent. That makes sense in a sense, and I think it's maybe one of the problems of the older clergy is to demonize those movements in young people, to say like, oh, they're more conservative. It's because something's wrong with them. Instead of saying like, oh, there's probably a reason for that. I might not always agree with what they come to, but if we dehumanize them as like they're this position, just like it would be the same to dehumanize maybe priests who were liberal in the 1970s and 80s, to say like, oh, it's because they were evil or because they were bad. Like, oh, there was probably some. Now the fruits of what they did or didn't do might have ended up in some bad places, but to just automatically write people off and demonize them, I find is so destructive, and it's easy to do. We do that all the time. I do it all the time in my head. But I think if we're gonna, as a church, as priests, be able to model Jesus' prayer that they might be one. It's not that we all think the exact same. It's that even when we disagree, we still love each other and pursue each other. Because I think that's a lot harder to do, but it's so key and important right now.
I want to circle back on something you guys mentioned there, which is the over busyness. Like, you're overworked, you're overscheduled. You said sometimes it's even a joy for you. You know, you don't have time to be lonely. But another kind of shocking statistic that came out with this report was that 45% of priests, no matter when they were ordained, 45% say that they feel they are being asked to do too much that is outside their priestly calling. So maybe for those who haven't worked in parish setting, diocesan setting, they look at a priest, maybe they grew up online, they think, no, they're just like reading theology all day, they're celebrating the sacraments and multiple holy, one, for those who might not even know what that means, what is that? Like, what are priests being asked to do that is not, that they would say is outside of their priestly calling? What does that mean?
Can I get just a list from you, Father Tom, since you as a parish, you as a pastor in a parish, began a new parish, bought a new property, refurbished, like what does that list look like for you as far as all the things that weren't priestly activities that you had to do?
It's been fun. It's been fun. It's been fun building something from the ground up and establishing, or as I tell people, like, I didn't inherit someone's dysfunction.
You get to create your own
I'm creating my own dysfunction. Yeah. But definitely, well, the one thing that burns out priests more than anything else, and I think that this is across the board, you can talk to any priest, it's administration. So it's administration, and it's the expectation of administration, specifically in financial matters. It's like we were trained in theology, pastoral ministry, high levels of counseling, high levels of obviously theological studies, so you could be a competent preacher. And really, half of us to all of us end up in administration positions where we're having to be ultimately accountable for the finances, and that's what every father has to do. He has to run his own house. But there's a certain level where you end up running a small to medium to sometimes large-sized business. And so you have personnel issues. And so like that's the thing, is like how much of our ministry is just dealing with personnel issues, and which has nothing to do with, it's just a personality conflicts and things like that you deal with in an office. So if you don't outsource that as a priest and you don't hire competent people who can kind of take over some of that roles and responsibility, even sometimes bookkeeping, like some guys have to run the books. Like in our diocese now, the diocese is at least has a accounting department that can take on some of that for some of the smaller parishes. But like between fundraising, and then not even getting into fundraising, although fundraising is kind of fun because you're at least being with people and you're kind of fundraising, you're building relationships. But then you have the stress of building loans. Like, I'll tell you this, I know more about construction and building than I ever thought I would. I know more about air conditionings and air handlers and things like that than I ever wanted to know. And like, so when you get into all those different things, like you end up running a business. And that's the thing that burns out guys, because most guys who go in the priesthood are idealists. Like they're idealists, many of them are academics. I mean, I'm philosophical, I don't know if I'm necessarily academic. But you got a lot
you don't
of
have glasses.
Yeah, you got philosophers. You got that's the thing. You get philosophers. You get theologians. You get idealists who are going in to save the world and to save as many souls as possible. And then you end up managing money. So it's the management, and so like some guys, if the parish can afford it, will try to hire a person to help that. I'm actually in the middle of that right now. But like you end up doing things that really, your sphere of competency. Like you can have a natural skill for it, and you might even be decent at it, but it's not really what you want to be doing.
Yeah.
And that's what burns out guys. And that's the thing is, like, it's really the business administration side of running these small businesses, because there is a business side of the church.
Yeah.
It's a crazy business too. Like I talk, when I talk about with my friends that are, particularly other priests that are pastors, and just that it's just so strange to me that I can be in a finance council meeting where we're talking about the budget, we're talking about a capital campaign, we're doing, to pay down the loan for our building and all that. And then I go from there and immediately go visit somebody in the hospital afterwards. I'm like, I don't know of any CEO of a small company that has that kind of interplay of and then I go from there, and then I'm teaching a class, and and then after the class, someone's like, tell me about the divorce that they've just gone through, or tell me about their son or daughter who's addicted. And then, so in a sense, it's this, and they're all part of the business. They're all part. It's because it's a parish. It's all of those things, which is beautiful. I love it, but I also understand too that in those tough moments, especially, it can easily wear you down. So the fact that guys are being asked to do those sorts of things at younger and younger ages, I felt like I had good preparation. I had 4 years before I was made administrator and pastor. Other guys had longer. Some guys, I know some guys are made.
I avoided it for 10 years.
Yeah, exactly.
But then now I'm building it.
Yeah,
right. Up,
but I know some guys who they're made a pastor of 4 parishes their second year of priesthood, and then they're being asked. If you think of the guys up in the Northeast, and I think snow is beautiful. Snow is a beautiful idea down here in Florida. I'm like, oh, that's cool. You have snow, but when it's destroying roofs and doing this thing, and it's something that you're having to work on and maintain for a 100-year-old building or 300-year-old buildings, it can definitely wear on you. What it comes back to also, I think, is that the demographics have shifted as well. That we're not the direct, sons and daughters of World War II. That in a sense, like what we're comfortable with or not comfortable with has shifted as well. Just as a culture and a society, that if we're heavily medicated, we're heavily, we flee boredom at all times. All these things that in a sense used to be part of growing up that are now taken away from us because of technology and other things. Yeah, so no wonder that guys are struggling, and I think it's important for people to recognize that, not as a bad news, not like every priest you see is at the end of his rope, but man, what a difference it would make, I think, for parishioners who are members of a parish if they're reaching out to their priests to give encouragement, to invite guys to dinner, to reach out. Not that it's the parishioner's job to make sure the priest is okay. He's in charge of that ultimately. Yeah. But it does make a big difference when people just reach out to me and just say like, hey, I just want to reach out and say like, you're doing a great job. I'm like, oh, I am? Just that kind of reality I think is rare, because we get the bad news constantly. And praise God, the good news of Jesus Christ outweighs all of the bad news. But when you're dealing with that every single day and kind of going from one to it can definitely wear you down. Yeah.
Also, I would say this just on a personal level. Like building and buying the property, renovating it, and doing all that was necessary, and still in the middle of that. But we just started up a new OCIA, and the year
people that are coming into
the
OCIA,
Catholic Church. Yeah, people coming to the Catholic Church, which I've always did for 10 years, and I was the predominant person in charge of that. Ran it, taught the majority of classes. But as I've entered more into administration, like I had given that to other people to run and do. And this past year, I was just like, you know what? I'm not doing enough teaching with people, and I need to be back in the classroom, because like I'm getting a little burnt out on this. So like I put myself intentionally back into a primary teaching role, because that's actually the great thing I love about OCIA or RCIA is like that's a very low-hanging fruit, and it's actually very encouraging if you engage in it and things like that, because you have people who are excited. It's just a really good ministry. But a lot of guys, as priests, because there's all these other important things, like the things that we love are sometimes the things that we don't get to do unless you're very intentional, unless you kind of prioritize that, because you end up getting sucked into endless meetings.
A lot of meetings.
Not counting your emails and all the different things like that. And so but there is good things, but you have to be very intentional as a priest in order to prioritize and make sure that you're being spiritually and mentally and emotionally fed. Because it's not just about you feeding other people, it's that the ministry itself, the feeding is meant to be those who give, receive, and you're supposed to be able to receive at the same time. And that's why those ministries do sometimes get put on back burner because you're just like, well, I'm the only person who can do certain other things. And it can get exhausting,
Yeah.
I do love, and this is the last thing I'll say about loneliness is when, as priests, when we prioritize making time to get together, and particularly for younger guys, when they prioritize getting together, grabbing lunch with an older priest. I mean, there's something about that I think is really awesome and life-giving. I've got several older priests that every time I sit down and talk with them, I'm enriched by what they've gone through, the struggles that they face. They might be a little more liturgically or theologically liberal than I am, but they've stayed faithful, and they're still here 30, 40, 50, 60 years after ordination. And that ain't nothing, and that's me. I'm edified and encouraged by that. And I think that's something that can really break down a lot of those. And even bringing up with them struggles with loneliness or struggles with whatever it might be, struggles with the diocese or administration, hearing their take on it oftentimes is very, is sometimes hilarious because you're like, man, times have changed. You couldn't just tell the diocese, none of your business, for administration like back in the good old days. But also just seeing how guys that have done it and have lived it, I think is really important for us.
So one maybe encouraging number that came out of this study was around trust in the bishop, which has increased in several years. Now the number's still pretty low, unfortunately. So in 2022, 22% of priests said that they felt a sense of trust in their bishop. That's gone up by 3%. Now it's reported as 25%. So
victory. Good job, bishops.
Yeah.
You did it.
So there's just an alarm bell maybe for people who are hearing that. Like, why would that be so low? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Why is that number so low? But also, what's maybe leading to some change in recent years with that?
Yeah, I mean, going back to there's probably lots of reasons for that. Probably that ordained in the 1980s or ordained in the 2010s and beyond. That's kind of your divide right now between bishops and priests. So you're definitely going to have some theological shifts, some other things. The reality too here in the United States, so after the sexual abuse crisis kind of broke after the Boston Globe, the Spotlight stories, broke that open in the early 2000s, the United States bishops came up with what's called the Dallas Charter. And the Dallas Charter basically set up very, could say aggressive and needfully aggressive. Well, you could say draconian, how you say it, but responses to if a priest is accused, how do we treat that? How do we remove them from ministry? Kind of like fast tracking all of those things in response to where those things had not been fast tracked for a long time. So that's been going on since the Dallas Charter has been in effect since before we were ordained and continues to be in effect now. There's been some amendments to it at the U.S. Bishops Conference level, but since then in 2018 we had the Pennsylvania grand jury report, but we also had good old Ted McCarrick. So Ted McCarrick was a former. Is he deceased now? I think he is.
I believe so.
God rest his soul. Have mercy on his soul. So he had been a cardinal, very powerful, influential cardinal, one of the main drafters of the Dallas Charter. That he himself, as a bishop, had been credibly accused, both of abuse as a priest and as a bishop, of minors, of seminarians, of all sorts of things, and had kind of because he was in a position of authority, had been able to kind of stay out of any sort of trouble until after he was out of ministry. So this kind of shift, which the Pope has tried to, Pope Francis put out a letter, the Vos Estis kind of thing that allows, if a bishop is in some sort of troubling situation, or the bishop is guilty of abuse or of negligence and abuse, how are they prosecuted within the church? So all this is unfolding as we speak. But what that has led to, unfortunately, is oftentimes priests can feel like they're sort of out on a limb, and the bishops are just ready at the drop of a hat to fire them, to leave them out to dry, to keep them out of ministry if they've been accused, but nothing's been brought up against them. So all these sorts of things. So there's definitely some contention and some friction. I think that's in a lot of dioceses that feel that, where guys feel my bishop doesn't trust me, and I don't really trust him. And so I'm gonna be professional, but I'm not gonna tell him, hey man, I've been struggling. Like, as soon as like I've been struggling, which is sad, because that's a normal part of being a Christian, is being able to say, like, man, I've been struggling. But to feel like you're in a situation where you can't say to your bishop, hey, I've been struggling, because then that's a red flag towards something worse might be going on underneath the surface. So you're now viewed with suspicion, or you're moved from ministry or anything else.
So if 40% feel lonely, 45% feel overburdened by things outside of their priestly call, to even say I'm struggling to the bishop, like, who's supposed to be the father of the priest. There's automatic walls that go up to keep that divided. Man, that's wild. Any thoughts on how does that number hit you, and maybe what could we be doing to help establish more trust between priests and their bishops?
I mean, I think that the way that you build trust is through vulnerability. So if you don't have vulnerability, or if one person is vulnerable and the other person is not vulnerable, then it's a one-sided vulnerability. So because trust goes two ways. So you can't have you can't have trust, in my opinion, without mutual vulnerability, which means that you have to be able to give power to another person and they have power over you, and then as so far that they don't use that power in a harmful way, then you can build trust. So kind of what Father Michael was saying in regards to like the Dallas Charter stuff, priests as a whole, probably rightfully so, have been placed in a very vulnerable position. And so because at any time you can get an accusation, things like that, and you're removed. And there's some recourse, but it's like we're just in a very vulnerable position in that regard. And that has probably caused some mistrust and some anger from priests. It's like, that's fine. Like, maybe we deserve this because of the actions of the few who did this. I would point out, it was the few. It was not the majority of priests who were doing that. It was about 2% that were, at least in terms of pedophilia and things like that, which brought about the Dallas Charter. But the question is like, if you're going to have trust, which is rebuilt, then there has to be mutual. And there has to be mutual vulnerability. And that vulnerability is not just talking about things. It's about actually putting it into practice, which I think that what Pope Francis has done was a good thing. Because then the question is, are we all in the same boat together, or are you in the boat and we're in the dinghy? If that makes sense. Yeah. So when you're put in a dinghy, like that places it. And so I think that's one thing, but I think that the other one is like really priests who know each other and who live together and who love each other, like that's where there's trust. And the same thing is like when the bishops, and there are bishops who do get to know their priests and have a personal relationship. One of the things that I love about our bishop is that like when we have nights where we're for convocation or for a retreat, he comes out and spends time with us. He gets to know all of us. And so I think that that's a skill set, and that's the problem. Sometimes the guys who sometimes get promoted, both in the parishes and as priests, and then likewise in the episcopacy, sometimes good administrators get promoted, but good administrators don't always have good people skills. So if you want to have greater trust, you have to have good people skills. So that's sometimes the things that are not always validated is because sometimes good people skills means that your administrative skills or your organizational skills might sometimes be not as strong, if that makes sense. So I think it's a question of like who is being promoted, promoted, whatever you want to, I don't know how you talk.
Demoted to bishop.
Who's being demoted, promoted. But the question is like what type of guys are you promoting and what type of guys are being elevated to the episcopacy, and looking at that, and do they not just have the administrative or the canonical and the theological skills, do they actually have the pastoral skills? If that makes sense. Do they have the pastoral skills and the leadership skills where you can actually motivate and inspire your leaders? Because like it's not just about being good with the people, it's about inspiring leaders, because if you want your priests to be motivated and activated to and brought to their highest degree of efficiency, as well as of doing what they have to also be inspired by their bishop. But it's hard to be inspired by a person who doesn't know you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that goes. So Pat Lancioni has this concept of vulnerability-based trust that I think is trust is not performance-based. Like, oh, I know Tom. He's going to do a good job. He works hard. like that's that's sort of, he does things, and I've seen him do those things, so I know he's going to do those things. That's the one aspect. I trust he's going to accomplish the goal. Rather, it's vulnerability-based trust is I'm able to share where I struggle and it be received, and for you to be able to do the same thing. But that has to come from the leadership down. So that's something for myself as a pastor with my leadership team, that I have to be able to do that with them. So the same thing comes from bishops. And where bishops have done that appropriately, it's awesome. I would say our bishop does a really good job with that. So I've heard of a bishop here in the United States who always had kind of the MO of being very conservative, very traditional, very kind of cold, very, all those things, that he's gone through the past several years a deeper conversion of the heart, and gone through his own healing process as well, doing things with like Dr. Bob Schutz with the Healing the Whole Person and the JP2 Healing Center in Tallahassee, which is here in our diocese. And there's other bishops that have gone through that as well, but he's gone through it, and then it allowed him to be a place of recognizing his own areas of woundedness, his own from growing up, and how that's impacted him as a leader, and then to be able to bring that to his priests and be able to apologize from that place of like where he wasn't a father, where he was, where he was making the right decision, but maybe doing it in an authoritarian way, and led to this place of huge reconciliation with his priests, which I'm like, that's what we should be praying for every single presbyterate, every single gathering of priests in every single diocese. But it took the bishop going first. It took those in authority taking that step. And I think for us as priests, we have to be aware of that. We can't just wait for the bishop to do it for us, but in our sphere of influence and leadership, to be able to say, like, how can I be appropriately vulnerable and appropriately open to being the man that God's created me to be, and what's keeping me from doing that too? Because that's part of it as well. Is no matter what our formation was or what the demographic is, all of us are wounded. All of us have. I can speak for myself. I have tons of my own sins to worry about. But where is God calling me to deeper conversion? How do I and healing? And how do I bring people into that to help me so I can be a better priest? Because that's really ultimately what we should want, is to be more effective priests to help people encounter Jesus.
Yeah.
But more effective priests are not doing more work. More effective priests are actually in relationship with Christ, with each other, and like that there's love. So that's the thing, is we're not sure. We don't want to just become a more effective world. We want to be more on fire, more in love.
Amen.
All right. And maybe to finish on a more hopeful note there, a number that came back in this study was around confidence in Pope Leo. Now, we're filming this in late October of 2025. That papacy is still pretty fresh, but 86% of priests across the board in this study reported a higher level of confidence in Pope Leo. I'm curious to hear, how does that hit? Does that resonate for y'all? And what's behind that?
Yeah.
Well, he hasn't said anything. He hasn't said very much, which has been, I think, probably one of the things that has given a lot of people confidence, is because he's not as bombastic or as forthcoming with his thoughts and his words as Pope Francis was. So I think that there's a collective sigh of relief that he's not making as many off-the-cuff statements. He seems to be more measured in his. Like I said, I liked Francis, generally speaking, but Pope Francis. But I think that Pope Leo, he's said a lot less. And so I think that there's just been a collective sigh of relief from many pastors and many priests that we're having a lot less to explain on a daily basis to a lot of people. So I think that's what actually I heard going into the conclave. Many people are just saying, we would like a much more quiet papacy for the next one. So Pope Leo's come out with some more recent stuff, which has kind of stirred the waters. But I think that a vast majority of people, just because there is stylistically, there's a big difference between Leo's style and Pope Francis's style. That there's been that's definitely, I think, is brought him up in the polls.
Yeah. I love every pope, man. I love Pope Francis. Love Pope Leo the 14th.
No, I don't like Alexander the Fourth.
Oh man, I love him. He's in my top. He's in my top 270 popes. But yeah, I think obviously Pope Leo's going to have to continue to make difficult decisions as his administrative aspect. I think our administrative aspect is tough. There's lots of administrative decisions that come up, and sometimes the Holy Spirit allows the church to be guided in faith and morals to be able to teach infallibly in faith and morals, and the Pope has that authority as well.
Bless-
It's not administration, unfortunately. The Pope is not infallible in administrative decisions. It's not infallible in personnel decisions or in lots of other things, opinions voiced
blessing ice statues.
political takes. Yeah, and that's the thing too. And it is fascinating to me. I think the Vatican is about 45 years behind a basic understanding of how the internet works, how PR works. So they're just now starting to understand, like, oh, there's this thing called the internet. So when the Pope says something or does something, it goes around the world instantaneously. So we're slow. We're kind of slow on the uptake with that. But hopefully it will start to impact a little bit more the way optics and pictures and decisions, because there was Pope Francis at some prayer service for ecology. They brought like a part of an iceberg or something, and they had him bless that as like blessing. Like you do a blessing over water, which I guess that is water. It's just one different form of water. He can totally do that if he wants to. But it's an odd picture, and so to recognize, okay, what's the optics of this? Can we do this? Yes. Can the Pope do that? Absolutely. But should they do it?
If I can say
that's
this,
another one.
I kind of like the fact that in our extremely optic-driven, media-driven world, where everything is about optics and spin and narrative and storytelling, and combating that I kind of like the fact that Pope Leo has made some decisions where he didn't really care about the optics, and he just did what he thought was right. So you might disagree with it, but
it's possible.
But on the other hand, like just being overly concerned with optics might not be necessarily the best way to go. But on the other hand, it does make a lot more work for us when we have to explain the optics of some event that happened with the Vatican.
Good thing about it. I'm in favor of him. I think he's doing great.
I like him. Yeah,
I'm praying for him every day.
I pray for him. Yeah, pray for him every time I say the Mass and elsewhere. So,
Well, a lot of signs of hope. Obviously, we need to be praying for our priests.
Please pray for us.
Pray for the bishops, praying for the Pope. But a lot of signs of hope in the church, locally, internationally. Yeah. So, thank you guys. Good conversation.